Hi, I'm Jonah, and this is a Discover New Sounds tutorial for the Middle Eastern scale. The scale is also known as a Byzantine scale, or a double harmonic scale, or an Arabic scale, along with other names as well. But it's essentially that scale that to the Western ear often sounds exotic because of the changes that it has in it, and has that Middle Eastern feel to it. It sounds great on the native flute. Because of the wood and the tone of the native flute, I think this scale really works well with it. It's also a challenging scale to play on the native flute because it has a lot of cross-fingerings. Pretty much the whole scale is all cross-fingerings. So if you haven't played with cross-fingerings before, this one might take you some time to learn. I think of this as being kind of an advanced scale. That doesn't mean that you can't learn it. I think anybody can learn this scale, or any of the scales. It just takes time to teach your fingers the muscle memories to catch the notes. Now, this scale also uses notes that are over the octave. So if you're playing bass tone flutes, depending on your flute, you might not be able to hit those notes true to the tone of the scale, to the note pitches of the scale. That said, though, if you're just playing on your own, it still often will sound really great. It's often that usually comes into play more when you're playing with other people. So still give it a go, or just stay in the lower register and play the notes in that area of the flute, and often you can find really cool melodies in that range as well. Now I'm going to show you the scale physically on the flute, and I'll work through the fingering chart a little bit, talk about the fingering chart. I'll play an improvisation that's in the scale, and then I'll talk a little more in depth about the scale, and then I'll play another improvisation as well. Now for bass tone flutes, there's some alternate fingerings as you go over the octave that raise the pitch a little bit, that might be able to get it so that you hit the tones, those higher tones, a little more true, and it looks like this. It's a little windy here, so it's taking the voice, but you get the picture of it. So this is the fingering chart for the Middle Eastern scale, and this fingering chart is downloadable from our website, highspirits.com, under Discover New Sounds, so you can find it there. And as you've seen where I just showed you the fingering physically on the flute and from this fingering chart, that it's a scale that requires a lot of muscle memory to get the sequence of notes correct. And there's a lot of cross-fingering, but even when it's not cross-fingering, it's just an odd sequence of notes. It's kind of all over the place. So it can take some time to teach your fingers the muscle memory to stay within the scale as you're playing it. Now, one thing that's probably pretty noticeable is that the scale does not start with all the holes closed. It starts with the bottom hole open, and that's the first note in the scale. And that's because the low note in the scale, from the low note to the next note up, is a half step or one semitone. So if we look on a keyboard and we start at A, a half step or one semitone takes you from A to A sharp. So if you're playing an A flute, you would need to be able to go from A to A sharp. However, on a native flute in the key of A, the low note to the next note up is A to C, which is 3 semitones or a step and a half. And that's true on all native flutes. From the low note to the next note up is 3 semitones or a step and a half. And even if we half hole the bottom hole, that only gives us a whole step or 2 semitones. And it doesn't get us that half a step or that 1 semitone that we're going to need. And so in order to get the 1 semitone that we need to play the scale, you would have to quarter hole the low note. And half holing alone is pretty challenging. So instead, there's an alternative that we change the tonic note to the next note up. And from that note, we can easily go from this fingering to this fingering and get that 1 semitone or half a step that this scale requires. Now, if you're playing a lower midtone flute like an F sharp, or a bass tone flute like a bass E or D or deeper, these upper notes, these 2 notes, often won't play either easily or they won't play in pitch. They'll be a little bit out of tune to what is normal for this scale. So you can try one of these alternative fingerings for these notes. Sometimes they get you closer right on, sometimes not. So just give it a go. And so if you're playing on your own and you hit those notes and they sound good to you, that's great. Just go ahead and play with them. But if either you don't like them or if you're playing with other people, that like on a guitar or a piano or something, it might clash if it's because it'll be out of tune. And so my suggestion would be to play up to the octave. So you would play these notes and then just play around in creating melodies in those notes. Now, some of the more challenging jumps that I found for my fingering was going from this note to this note. And then also when going from this note down to this note, I seem to have a hard time remembering to close both those holes. So one of the things that I found really helpful is to have this fingering chart in front of me when I'm playing. It just gives me a visual of how I can jump around and what the next note is, or how do I go from, let's say, this note down to a lower note like this note, and then I can actually visually see the fingerings, and that's really helpful. And it also allows me to experiment with jumping from, let's say, like this note up to this note, where if I'm just playing it and it's like so tenuous just to get to the next note or just to remember what notes to play, that I'm not as apt to want to jump notes or try new combinations. So having this fingering chart in front of you can be really helpful. Now, if you have a bass flute and you're not getting those upper notes, this is an example of something you'd play in just the lower octave. So a little more about the scale. So as you can see with the fingerings, it's a big scale. Like, it's a lot to work with your fingers, especially if you start trying to go fast. So I suggest in the beginning playing really slow melodies, like this first one that I played, and because it gives you more time in your mind to create those transitions with your fingers. And then as your fingers become more used to it, you can start speeding up your melodies. Now, like most scales, this has a kind of a quintessential sequence of notes that gives it its feel, and there's quite a few of them. But it's kind of like a sequence of 3 or 4 notes going up and down in sequence. So for example, starting on the tonic note, or if we start up higher, so it kind of has that, that sound to it, that kind of exotic sound to it. So that's one thing to play with, especially in the beginning, just to start getting a feel for the scale. As you play with the scale more, you might notice that the tonic note doesn't always have this real sense of completion, especially depending on how you lead up to that note. Sometimes if you lead up to it in certain ways, it really doesn't have a sense of completion, and actually the next note up really feels like the tonic note. So this is what I'm saying, what I'm referring to is this. So right there, it doesn't really have a sense of completion. It feels like there's still movement. So depending on how I lead up to it, that tonic note, which usually has that resolution, that real sense of like finished, doesn't always have it. But that next note up would in that particular case. It kind of has more of a sense of completion to it. So sometimes that next note up will actually end up being your tonic note. And it has a real nice sense of completion to it. So you can play around with using different notes as your tonic note, as that kind of baseline note. And that's a real interesting exercise in note relation and tension and resolution. Notes that have a feeling of motion or tension in them, where they pull you to the next note, and notes that have a feeling of finality, resolution, where they really finish something or they have a pausing feel to them. And that is, in a scale, it's a relation between the notes that creates that. Like you saw, the tonic note can have that sense of completion. Has that sense of completion, or it can have a sense of motion. I feel like I'm wanting to go. Kind of has it has more of a completion feel to it. At least it does for me. So, and it's a relative thing, but it has that feel to it. So tension and resolution is an interesting part of music, and it's all about relations of notes and how you lead up to a note. It creates those feelings.